To tip off this NBA season on FanDuel, you can choose your own rewards, which means you can play your game any way you want.
I get to choose my rewards?
Yep.
Great! Now, excuse me while I lock in.
All customers choose your own reward right now in the FanDuel app. 21 plus and present in select states. 18 plus in Kentucky. Opt-in required. Rewards are non-withdrawable. Restrictions apply, including bonus and token expiration, leg requirement, and max wager amount. See full terms at FanDuel.com/sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
All governments realise that to wage war successfully, their troops must learn to dehumanise the enemy. The simplest way to achieve this is to inflame nationalistic or racist feelings, or both. Thus writes Philip Knightley, the author of The First Casualty, a supremely talented journalist and a historian of the war correspondent. The First Casualty, as I've talked about this book before, is a history of the war correspondent as hero, propagandist and mythmaker. And in this episode of the Explaining History podcast, we're going to look at how Martha Gellhorn, one of the most famous journalists of the 20th century, reported on the Vietnam War. So welcome again to another episode of the Explaining History podcast. And as I said, we are looking today at Martha Gellhorn. Martha Gellhorn, who had a long and distinguished war reporting career dating back to the Spanish Civil War, who was contemporaries with the likes of Ernest Hemingway, and who had a relationship with him, who reported from Normandy and during the Normandy landings, and who was reporting on war right into her very old age. And one of the most significant journalistic figures of the 20th century. Philip Knightley first gives us a kind of a background of American atrocities in the Vietnam War. And of course, the Vietnam War had been a ground for imperialist atrocities before this point, under the French. But the war that America wages in Vietnam is a kind of like a brutal racialized conflict with the GIs encouraged to see the Vietnamese population as less than human. Thus, writes Philip Knightley, American racism, which had first been aroused on a national scale in the Second World War and had then revived in Korea, reached a peak in Vietnam. But Vietnam was an insurgency war. The enemy was physically indistinguishable from the ally. Racist hate directed at Charlie Cong, the enemy, made no provision for exempting those Vietnamese that the United States had to intervene to save. Of course, America was there really to protect its own interests. Vietnam was going to be part of the encirclement of Maoist China. And there's a great section in Julia Lovell's Maoism: A Global History, where the writer portrays a kind of a moment in an American propaganda film where China is seen as this kind, I think the some kind of great octopus, sort of its tentacles spreading all across Southeast Asia. And if you think about what American interest in, say, Pakistan was, American interest in Indochina, America's interest in Taiwan, in Korea, in Japan, in the Philippines, and the Pacific Islands, it was about creating a circle around this desperately alarming state that emerges in 1949, a state that as America obviously had a huge interest in, and America had all sorts of kind of quasi-imperial designs on China. There was these sort of notions that a nationalist China could be kind of grudgily groomed to be an American, at the very least, marketplace, or kind of an allied liberal power in Asia. This is to kind of really ignore several thousand years of Chinese history, and particularly the previous century of Chinese history, a century of humiliation. And of course, it all falls apart even before 1949, as America suddenly realizes that nationalists are far too corrupt and ineffectual to win the civil war against Mao. Anyway, that's just a kind of like a roundabout way of making the point that this idea of a kind of American liberation, freeing the Vietnamese from themselves, was nothing more than the attempts to kind of snuff out a national liberation movement. And that's the other kind of key objective in Vietnam, is the idea that successful national liberation movements are really extremely bad for business when you're the supreme imperial power in the world. Anyway, as to continue with Philip Knightley. Racist hate against Charlie Cong made no enemy. The enemy made no provision for exempting those Vietnamese that the United States had intervened to save. In motivating the GI to fight by appealing to his racist feelings, the United States military discovered that it had liberated an emotion over which it was to lose control. Sancho had written that American racism, anti-Negro, anti-Mexican, anti-Asian, is a fundamental fact which goes very deep and which existed potentially or in fact long before the Vietnam War. Well, I mean, that doesn't, it's kind of goes without saying, rather, American racial sentiment, well, white American racial sentiment towards those three groups is prevalent in, a century beforehand. And of course, this is to ignore powerful anti-racist movements among white Americans as well, but very easy to awaken in GIs serving far away from home. In Vietnam, racism became a patriotic virtue. All Vietnamese became dinks, slopes, slants, or gooks, and the only good one was a dead one. So the Americans killed them when it was clear they were Viet Cong. I shot up a Charlie in the paddies today, Frank Harvey quotes an American helicopter pilot as saying. I ran that little mother all over the place, hosing it with guns, but somehow or other we just didn't hit him. Finally he turned on us and stood there facing us with his rifle. We really busted his ass then, blew him up like a toy balloon. And they killed them when it was clear they were not Viet Cong. A British freelance reporter, Philip Jones Griffiths, went out with a platoon from the 1st Cavalry. The GIs were nervous and opened fire on the first farmer they saw. They missed, Jones Griffiths wrote. The next farmer was not so lucky. Soon he lay dying among the ripening rice in a corner of the paddy field, the back of his skull blown away. He was somehow conscious, making a whimpering sound and trying to squeeze his eyes more tightly shut. He never spoke and died with the fingers of his left hand clenching his testicles so tightly they could not be undone. "Got him in the balls! Knew I hit him!" cried the boy from Kansas, until someone took him to one side and explained that they do that to relieve the pain elsewhere. Some Americans mutilated bodies. One colonel wanted the hearts cut out of dead Viet Cong to feed to his dog. Heads were cut off, arranged in a row, and a lighted cigarette pushed into each mouth. Ears were strung together like beads. Parts of Vietnamese bodies were kept as trophies. Skulls were a favourite, and the then Colonel George Patton III, I do like to see arms and legs fly, carried one about at his farewell party. Some Americans photographed dead Vietnamese as if they were game trophies, a smiling Marine with his foot on the chest of the nearest corpse or holding a severed ear or two. Or, in the case of a dead Viet Cong girl, without her pyjama pants and with her legs raised stiffly in the air. The 25th Infantry Division left a visiting card, a torn-off shoulder patch of the division's emblem, stuffed in the mouth of the Vietnamese they killed. Other divisions had similar practices. Killing Vietnamese became almost mundane, almost like a movie in which the Americans were cowboys and the Vietnamese were the Indians. Bachelor squeezes off a careful shot. The Marines around him cheer. Holy Jesus, did you see that? Just like the movies. The guy sagged and then just kind of slowly slid down onto the doorway. Ian Adams in the Maclean's magazine, February 1968. Captain Lynn A. Carlson, who flew a Cobra helicopter gunship out of Pleiku, used to drop specially printed visiting cards over his target areas. The cards read, "Congratulations, you've been killed through courtesy of the 361st. Yours truly, Pink Panther 20. On the reverse side were various messages. Call us for death and destruction night and day, or the Lord giveth and the 20mm cannon taketh away. Killing is our business, and business is good." It's a kind of a degree of normalized depravity. The kind of place that I think that dehumanization takes the pilot to when they are openly joking, and obviously the message is meant to be intimidatory, but it's said with almost like an inevitability that the victim, the reader, is going to die, and there's sort of not very much that they can do about it. They have no agency. And so the message is almost a kind of a reflective message back to the helicopter pilot, telling the helicopter pilot that they have nothing to, that they have nothing to fear. Of course, they did have things to fear. They were going to be shot at, but the kind of the death of the enemy is inevitable. Whether that means equates to victory is a different matter altogether. But the thing that is happening here, I believe, is the helicopter pilot having a kind of a dialogue with themselves, and perhaps in that way externalizing all the anxieties and uncertainties they have about the war in this kind of horrific, macabre way. I think that kind of nihilism. I mean, there were atrocities in the Second World War. Not, I think, on the Allied side, in all the stats show, not in any way to the same level, but did American and indeed British soldiers sometimes shoot the German or Italian prisoners they captured, or the Japanese? Yeah, they did. I think military discipline was probably far more significant and far more far-reaching in the Allied armies during the Second World War. And most of the, particularly in the Western Front, there were civilian casualties, yeah. but it's a very different kind of war. There are all sorts of conspiracy theories particularly amongst American soldiers on D-Day, that the French locals were kind of in cahoots with the Germans, and you couldn't trust them. You have to be very wary of them. And there was sometimes a little bit of trigger happiness towards them, but it was not in any way the same thing. And I think that the moral argument for the Second World War, at least in the eyes of those participating in it, and the kind of the motivation and justification for prosecuting the war, is kind of clear in the minds of those who are fighting it, and you get, I think, this kind of twisted nihilism, particularly when those fighting the war and dying and being shot at on the American side can't think of any meaningful argument as to why this is happening, as to why the war is being fought. I mean, there are all sorts of justifications, but for most soldiers were under no illusions that the war was there was no meaningful threat to America, no meaningful threat to the American way of life, and the people whom they had been sent notionally to liberate clearly did not want that degree of liberation. I mean, there were plenty of people in Vietnam who did not want to be ruled by Ho Chi Minh. This is true, but there was the kind of jaded, disaffected, disillusioned mentality, combined with this racialism that Philip Knightley speaks of, creates eventually this kind of sick pathology amongst many soldiers, and it's a kind of a shared understanding that one can kill with impunity, and it really doesn't matter.
You worked all day, kids just got home, everyone's hungry. Now what? I'm Melissa Benishai, CEO and co-founder of Baked by Melissa, and I'm partnering with Blue Apron to bring you meals that make dinner easy, like 15-minute salmon and tzatziki. These meals are quick and delicious, and you don't even need to subscribe in order to make them. Get 35% off your first order at Blue Apron with promo code Melissa. Terms and conditions apply. Visit blueapron.com/terms for more. Okay, love you. Bye.
To tip off this NBA season on FanDuel, you can choose your own rewards, which means you can play your game any way you want.
I get to choose my rewards?
Yep.
Great! Now, excuse me while I lock in.
All customers choose your own reward right now in the FanDuel app. 21 plus and present in select states. 18 plus in Kentucky. Opt-in required. Rewards are non-withdrawable. Restrictions apply, including bonus and token expiration, leg requirement, and max wager amount. See full terms at FanDuel.com/sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
Carlson clearly enjoyed his work. He was not alone in this. The late Nicholas Tomerlin of the Sunday Times of London spent an afternoon in June 1966 with General James F. Hollingsworth, and wrote about it in an article headed "The General Goes Zapping Charlie Cong." It began, after a light lunch last Wednesday, General James Hollingsworth of the US Big Red 1 Division took off in his personal helicopter and killed more Vietnamese than any of his troops he was commanding. Tomerlin described how the helicopter covered the landscape beside routes 13 and 16, while the general blazed away with his personal M16 carbine at anything Vietnamese seen running for cover. He concluded with Hollingsworth saying, "There's no better way to fight than going out to shoot VCs. And there's nothing I love better than killing Kong. No, sir." Set beside examples such as this, the fact that many helicopter pilots referred to their missions as turkey shoots was not surprising. However, the attitude of some of the army chaplains remains bewildering. Those at Phuket Air Base went around in a jeep on which was inscribed in bold white letters, "The Guard Squad." A Marine who had taken some horrifying photographs after an operation on the Qua Viet River became worried about the morality of having done so and asked his chaplain for advice. Michael Herr, the author of Dispatches, probably the most famous book on the Vietnam War, Michael Herr reported in Esquire in April 1970 that all the chaplain did was tell the Marine that it was forgivable. He then put the pictures in his drawer and kept them. James Fox, an American writer based in London, met a Cobra pilot who planned to become a Lutheran missionary when he left Vietnam. Fox asked the pilot whether he felt any conflict between his religion and his gunship work. "Oh, you ought to be here with Father Dodge," the pilot replied. "He always used to say, 'The faster you get 'em, the quicker their souls get to heaven.' I feel I'm killing to spare souls." Some of this side of the war appeared in American newspapers and magazines, but not without difficulty. General Hollingsworth's Cong zapping activities were known to American correspondents before Nicholas Tomlin wrote his story. "Geez, I'm so glad you was along," the general said. "I've been written up time and time again back in the States for shooting up VCs, but no one's been along with me like you before." Yet when Tomlin's graphic account was passed to the Washington Post, the Post refused to publish it. This is the post of the Pentagon Papers, the post of all the President's Men. That Washington Post. So the kind of the Ben Bradley version of the kind of the crusading Ben Bradley version of things we get. There is kind of slightly more to it than that. And eventually it appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle and was read in the Congressional Record, along with an official explanation from the United States Army. In short, until the My Lai massacre, American coverage was weak on the racist and brutalizing nature of the war and on the way Americans treated the Vietnamese. Herr offered one explanation in his Esquire article. A soldier from the 1st Infantry Division had just said that he believed that Americans treated the Vietnamese like animals. "You know what we do to animals? Kill them and hurt them and beat them and so on, so we can train them? Shit, we don't treat the dinks no different from that." Herr wrote, "We knew that he was telling the truth. We mentioned it later to some people who'd been at the pacification briefings, someone at the New York Times and someone at the Associated Press, and they both agreed that the kid from the Big Red One had said more about the Hearts and Minds program than they'd heard in over half an hour of statistics. But their bureaus could not use his story. They wanted Ambassador Comer's, and they got it, and you got it." So again, I mean, I think that one of the things that we have here, where we sit here in the 21st century, half a century after the Vietnam War ended, one of the ways in which we interpret the Vietnam War is through Vietnam War movies, which almost invariably present the Vietnam War as an American tragedy. Platoon, The Deer Hunter, the white working class Americans driven mad or driven to the point of moral breakdown by the kind of the cruelty and the inhumanity of the war. And if you are looking to make a more accurate movie about the Vietnam War, from a Vietnamese perspective, and I know Oliver Stone tried to do this with Heaven and Earth, you would write it from the pages of this book here. And then there was one, I forget the title of the film, but it is literally the most racist thing I've ever seen. And it's a Mel Gibson film, would you believe, where the brave U.S. Army is besieged by hordes and hordes of these kind of Vietnamese fanatics, fanatically wanting national liberation. Who could believe it? I don't want to go into it too far, but it's the fact that it was $100 million production and portrayed the Vietnamese North Vietnamese army is kind of, and the Viet Cong is sort of essentially kind of expendable cannon fodder, stroke Zulus almost. It's a kind of a sight to behold, and it's so far from any objective truth about the Vietnam War. In much the way the film Zulu is so far from any. I mean, the events happen, yeah, but if you divorce it from any meaningful context of European colonization of South Africa, then it's a right ripping kind of tale of daring do for boys, isn't it? But anyway, rant over. Perhaps the case of Martha Gellhorn deterred correspondents from writing this side of the war. Miss Gellhorn, a famous, experienced and respected war correspondent, Spain, China, Finland, Britain, Italy, France, Germany, went to Vietnam in 1966 to 67 as a freelance. Taking from the indoctrination lecture read to United States troops on their arrival in Vietnam the sentence, "To really and truly and finally win this war, we must win the hearts and the minds of the people of South Vietnam." She determined to see whether this central tenet of American doctrine was in fact being carried out. First, she visited Quy Nhon Provincial Hospital, where a team of dedicated New Zealand doctors and nurses were caring for wounded non-combatants under conditions suitable for the Crimean War. She reached the conclusion that we, unintentionally, are killing and wounding 3 or 4 times more people than the Viet Cong do. So we are told, on purpose. We are not maniacs or monsters, but our planes range the sky all day and all night, and our artillery is lavish, and we have much more deadly stuff to kill with. The people are there on the ground, sometimes destroyed by accident, sometimes destroyed because Viet Cong are reported to be among them. This is indeed a new kind of war, as the indoctrination lecture stated, and we had better find a new way to fight it. Hearts and minds, after all, live in bodies. Miss Gellhorn then went to an orphanage in Saigon, where Catholic nuns, desperate for funds to keep their institution going, under stress of new demands, wrote their first and only letter to the USAID Agency for International Development, which that year had a budget of $700 million, asking for money to build a rainwater system. The letter was not answered. The South Vietnamese Ministry of Social Welfare predicts an average of 2,000 more orphans this month, Miss Gellhorn wrote. Is it not strange that we count and proclaim only military casualties? These lonely waifs of war should be listed as wounded forever. In her article, Miss Gellhorn described a refugee camp, a dump heap, where just a few of the 1 million or more Vietnamese made refugee in the previous 2 years were housed. These peasants had survived the Viet Cong since 1957, on whatever terms, hostile or friendly, and the war however it came to them, but they cannot survive our bombs. Even the Catholic refugees did not leave their hamlets until the bombs fell. This was the wave of Catholic refugees that fled from North Vietnam into the south. Obviously, President Diem was Catholic, and Diem was part of this kind of Vietnamese elite that had found favour with the French, converted to Catholicism, and Diem himself had some wildly unrealistic plans to force Catholicism on Vietnam as part of the kind of the state religion. And so, as a result, amongst many of the Buddhist peasants, and obviously amongst the communists, Catholics were very, very unpopular. And it was many Catholics who fled Vietnam and were part of the kind of it's a horrible thing, the boat people who it would eventually find their way to places like Hong Kong. I always find that a really dehumanizing term. I wish there was a better one, Vietnamese refugees.
To tip off this NBA season on FanDuel, you can choose your own rewards, which means you can play your game any way you want.
I get to choose my rewards?
Yep.
Great! Now, excuse me while I lock in.
All customers choose your own reward right now in the FanDuel app. 21 plus and present in select states. 18 plus in Kentucky. Opt-in required. Rewards are non-withdrawable. Restrictions apply, including bonus and token expiration, leg requirement, and max wager amount. See full terms at FanDuel.com/sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
Before you begin your road trip, ask yourself, do you really need 5 full suitcases? With the 2026 Kia Sportage X-Pro's class-leading cargo space, you'll have room for what you need. Find out more at your local Kia dealer today. Keep the adventure going. Kia, movement that inspires.
Call 800-3334-KIA for details. Always drive safely and obey all traffic laws. Comparisons based on second row legroom and cargo space behind second row seats in the subcompact SUV class according to Kia segmentation as of October 2025.
We were uprooting the people from the lovely land where they had lived for generations, and the uprooted are given none bread but a stone. Not bread but a stone. Is this an honourable way for a great nation to fight a war 8,000 miles from its safe homeland? No newspaper in the United States would publish a series of articles. Everywhere I was told that they were too tough for American readers. Eventually, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch took the 2 mildest ones. Miss Gellhorn had to turn to Britain to get all 5 published. They appeared in The Guardian and ended Miss Gellhorn's career as a war correspondent in Vietnam. When she applied for a visa to return there, her request was refused. She tried over the years since then, applying at various South Vietnamese embassies around the world, and was refused every time. It appears I'm on some sort of blacklist, and I will not be allowed to report from South Vietnam again. Philip Jones Griffiths, one of the few photographers to concentrate on portraying what the war did to Vietnamese civilians, had great difficulty in finding an outlet for his work in the United States. I was told time after time that my photographs were too harrowing for the American market. When eventually a book of his photographs, Vietnam Inc., was published in the United States, the South Vietnamese government banned his return to Saigon. So later on in things like the Gulf War, the ideal way of managing the journalists was through kind of access, not so much about kind of banning them, but having the embedded reporter in the platoon of soldiers or the company of soldiers and going along and being carefully media managed, seeing some cool stuff with tanks and helicopters and having a nice bit of patriotic rah-rah and some drinks in the mess and being very well kind of looked after. This was a much more effective way of managing the press during the 2 Gulf Wars and various other American interventions around the world. During the Vietnam War, the implication was clear. If you want to work, you have to exist in a certain set of parameters. You can report the war, but you have to be careful how you report it. There's this sort of commercial justification. The American audiences won't want to see anything that's too upsetting, too harrowing, but also any reporting of war crimes means that you know what will happen to access later on. And again, this is sort of how political reporting is managed in most democracies. Notional democracies, you can have the big scoop now and do over a political figure, but that's your career is pretty much over at that point, and there are all sorts of stories that are never published and printed because the journalist knows that if you burn the contact, you lose the access, and that's you done forever. So the reason why I wanted to talk about Martha Gellhorn, not as only because she's a significant figure and just an absolutely majestically brilliant writer, but it also shows you the limits of what the crusading reporter can achieve. I mean, Philip Knightley in this book is really, really scathing about war reporters a lot of the time, and he says, they're often propagandists and liars, and people who select aspects of the truth, and people who are kind of highly partisan anyways. But when there is one like Martha Gellhorn, somebody who has a kind of integrity, then there are other ways of dealing with them. other ways of limiting access and other ways of kind of curtailing their ability. And it tells us a kind of a sad story in a way, in that one can only rely on the kind of the illusion of the crusading journalist to a certain extent. I mean, you have certain figures like her and Robert Fisk and John Pilger and various other people who are able to kind of push the limits of what's possible, but they are outliers for the most part. And outside of the movies, the crusading reporter often doesn't get the story, or the story is carefully managed until the conflict is over and everybody has kind of moved on. Anyway, so just to remind you guys, anyone who wants to get the podcast free of charge, well, free of adverts anyway, what I'm talking about, free of adverts, hop over onto Patreon, catch us there. I'm running a history masterclass on Sunday. You can sign up for that, and I'll be putting the recording live for anyone who wants to access it. It is in fact on America 1945 to 74, so it includes at least the domestic aspect of the Vietnam War, the protesting and counterculture and Nixon and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, hopefully I'll see some of you guys on Sunday. But until then, take good care, all the best, and thanks once again for supporting the podcast. Bye-bye.
This Valentine's Day, let Edible help you share the love. With same-day and next-day delivery or local pickup, we make it easy to be the hero of the holiday. Choose from our signature fresh fruit arrangements, indulgent dessert boards, or baked treats that arrive ready to wow. Whether it's for a new flame or your forever sweetheart, let Edible arrange the details so you can focus on the moment. Order online at edible.com or visit your local store today to find the perfect gift.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.